Rose stared at the letter in her hands, reading it for the 5th time. She still couldn't believe it. Her Uncle Frank, whom she had only met a handful of times in her life, had left her 50 acres of farmland in the countryside. At 45, after 20 years of working in an insurance office in the city, she now owned land. Real land with trees, grass, and open skies, things she only saw in movies or during her rare weekend getaways. The lawyer had called it prime agricultural property. Rose called it terrifying. She knew nothing about farming or rural life. Her small apartment with its tiny balcony of potted herbs was the extent of her experience with growing things. "What am I supposed to do with all this land?" she muttered, pouring herself another glass of wine. Her divorce had been finalized just 6 months ago, ending 15 years of marriage to a man who had slowly drained the life out of her. Now, as she was finally finding herself again, this unexpected inheritance appeared. Rose picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She needed someone practical, someone who wouldn't laugh at her confusion. Her eyes stopped at Jack, her nephew's name. Though they shared blood, they had grown distant over the years. He was 30 now, with an environmental engineering degree and a good job at a consulting firm. More importantly, he knew about land, plants, and building things. She pressed call before she could talk herself out of it. "Aunt Rose?" Jack's voice sounded surprised. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, well, sort of. I need your help with something unusual," she said, trying to sound casual. "I've inherited some land from Uncle Frank. 50 acres of it." There was a pause on the line. "Uncle Frank? The one with the weird hat collection?" Rose laughed. "That's him. Apparently he owned farmland, and now it's mine. I have no idea what to do with it, and I thought maybe you could come with me to look at it this weekend. It's about 5 hours from the city." Another pause. "This weekend?" "I know it's short notice," Rose said quickly, "but I'm completely lost here, Jack. The property taxes alone are giving me nightmares. I need to decide whether to sell it or—" She trailed off, not sure what the alternative was. "Okay," Jack said finally, "I can move some things around. I'll come." Relief flooded through Rose. "Thank you. I'll drive. We can leave Friday after work." After hanging up, Rose walked to her window and looked out at the city lights. For the first time in years, she felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. This land, this unknown, unexpected gift, was something entirely new in her carefully structured life. Friday arrived and Rose waited outside Jack's downtown apartment building. When he walked out, she was struck by how much he had changed. No longer the lanky college kid she remembered, Jack had filled out, his shoulders broader, his jawline more defined. His dark hair was shorter now, and he carried himself with quiet confidence. "Aunt Rose," he said, giving her a warm hug. "It's been too long." "It has," she agreed, suddenly aware of how nice he smelled, something woodsy and clean. "Thanks for doing this." The first hour of their drive was awkward, filled with small talk about work and weather, but as the city faded behind them and the landscape opened up, something shifted. They began sharing real stories, Jack's frustration with his company's environmental shortcuts, Rose's relief at ending her marriage. "He never hit me or anything like that," Rose explained, eyes on the road. "Tom just slowly made me smaller year by year, until I barely recognized myself." Jack nodded. "I remember how you used to be, always laughing, making plans. Then you got quieter whenever we visited." Rose glanced at him, surprised he had noticed. Their eyes met briefly, and she felt an unexpected warmth in her chest. For the first time, she was seeing her nephew as the man he had become, thoughtful, perceptive, and kind. The 5-hour drive no longer seemed long enough. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Rose realized this journey might be taking her somewhere she never expected to go. Darkness had fallen by the time they reached the small town nearest to the property. Rose pulled into the only motel, its neon vacancy sign flickering against the night sky. She hadn't planned this part carefully. There was only one room available. "I can sleep in the car," Jack offered, standing awkwardly in the motel office. "Don't be silly," Rose said. "The room has 2 beds. We're family." The word family felt strange on her tongue after their hours of intimate conversation. During the drive, they had moved beyond politeness into real connection. Jack had shared his dreams of someday creating sustainable living spaces. Rose had admitted how trapped she'd felt in her marriage and job. Their room was small but clean. Jack set their bags down and opened the window, letting in the cool night air. "It smells different here," he said. "Cleaner." Rose sat on the edge of one bed, suddenly tired. "Thank you for coming with me." "I know it was a lot to ask." Jack turned to her, his face half in shadow. "Actually, I needed this. I've been working non-stop for months. This feels like—" He paused, searching for the right words, "like escaping." Rose smiled. "I know exactly what you mean." They decided to find dinner, walking to a small diner down the street. Under the warm yellow lights, sitting in a booth with worn seats, they ordered burgers and shared a bottle of local beer. Rose couldn't remember the last time she had felt so relaxed, so present in a moment. "Remember those summers at the lake house?" Jack asked suddenly. "When I was maybe 12 or 13? Rose nodded, smiling at the memory. "Your dad would drive us all there for 2 weeks every July. You taught me how to swim," Jack said softly. "I was terrified of the water and Mom was too impatient with me. But you stayed in the shallow part for hours, just letting me get comfortable." "I'd forgotten that," Rose said, surprised that this memory meant something to him. "I haven't," Jack replied, his eyes meeting hers across the table. Something shifted between them, a current of connection that wasn't simply aunt and nephew, but two adults recognizing something in each other. Rose felt her cheeks warm and looked down at her plate. After dinner, they walked back under a sky full of stars, brighter than Rose had ever seen in the city. Their hands brushed accidentally as they walked, and neither pulled away for a moment. The touch sent a tingle up Rose's arm that both alarmed and excited her. Back in their room, they took turns in the small bathroom. Rose changed into her pajamas, thankfully not the old t-shirt she usually wore, but a matching set of soft cotton shorts and a tank top. When she came out, Jack was sitting on his bed in a t-shirt and sweatpants, looking at a map of the area on his phone. "The property should be about 15 minutes from here," he said, not looking up immediately. When he did, his eyes widened slightly at the sight of her. Rose felt suddenly self-conscious about her bare legs and arms. "We should get there early," she said, climbing quickly into her bed. "The lawyer said there's an old farmhouse, but he wasn't sure what condition it's in." Jack nodded, putting his phone down. "Sounds good." They turned off the lights, but sleep didn't come easily to Rose. She was acutely aware of Jack's presence in the other bed, just a few feet away. She could hear his breathing, not yet settled into the rhythm of sleep. "Rose," he said quietly into the darkness, "what are you hoping to find tomorrow?" She considered the question, staring up at the ceiling she couldn't see. "I'm not sure," she answered honestly. "Maybe a purpose, or freedom. Something different from what my life has been." "I hope you find it," he said softly. In the darkness, Rose smiled. "Me too." She turned on her side, facing away from him, but the awareness of him remained. As she drifted toward sleep, Rose realized that for the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow with real curiosity and hope. And some of that hope was tied to the man sleeping just across from her, a man she was beginning to see in a completely new light. Morning light filtered through the thin motel curtains, waking Rose earlier than usual. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself. Jack was still asleep in the other bed, his breathing deep and even. She allowed herself to watch him for a moment. His strong profile, the stubble darkening his jaw, one arm flung above his head. There was something intimate about seeing him like this, unguarded in sleep. She slipped quietly from bed and into the bathroom to shower. The water pressure was weak, but the water was hot, and Rose let it run over her body, washing away the long drive. Her mind kept returning to the strange new awareness she felt around Jack. It was inappropriate, she told herself firmly. He was her nephew. A small voice reminded her that they were both adults, not related by blood, who barely knew each other as grown people. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel with her hair damp, Jack was awake, sitting on the edge of his bed checking his phone. "Morning," he said, looking up. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, and Rose felt suddenly exposed. "Bathroom's free," she said quickly, turning away to find her clothes. "I'll get dressed while you shower." 20 minutes later, they were in the car, following directions to the property. Rose felt nervous, as if she were about to meet someone important, rather than see a piece of land. Jack seemed excited, pointing out interesting plants and rock formations as they drove deeper into the countryside. There, he said finally as they turned onto a narrow dirt road. According to the GPS, this is the entrance to your property. The dirt road wound through trees for about half a mile before opening onto a clearing. They both gasped. Before them lay a valley vibrant green with spring growth, bordered by gentle hills. A small lake glittered in the morning sun at the far end, and in the center stood a weathered but still sturdy-looking farmhouse with a wide porch and a red barn behind it. "Rose," Jack breathed, "it's beautiful." They parked near the house and got out slowly, both taking in the vastness and beauty of the land. The air smelled of grass and earth and something sweet. Wildflowers, perhaps. Rose felt a strange sensation in her chest, as if something long dormant was awakening. "Let's look inside," she said, pulling the old key from her pocket that the lawyer had given her. The farmhouse was dusty but surprisingly well preserved. The main floor had a large kitchen with an old wood stove, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a small study. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with an old clawfoot tub. The furniture was old but solid, heavy wooden pieces built to last. "This place has good bones," Jack said, running his hand along a wooden beam. "It needs work. But nothing major from what I can see." They spent the morning exploring the house and the immediate surroundings. The barn was full of old farming equipment, some of it still usable. There was a vegetable garden plot, overgrown but still defined by its wooden borders. An apple orchard, the trees now wild but still bearing fruit, stretched behind the barn. By midday they were sitting on the porch steps, drinking water and looking out over the land. Rose felt overwhelmed by possibilities. "Jack," she said suddenly, turning to him, "I want to keep it." He looked surprised. "The land? All of it?"
"Yes," she said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I want to live here, make something of this place." Jack was quiet for a moment. "What about your job? Your life in the city?" Rose laughed, the sound free and light. "What life? A job I hate, an empty apartment, friends I barely see because everyone's too busy. This," she gestured at the land before them, "this could be a real life." "It would be a lot of work," Jack said, but she could hear the excitement in his voice. "Especially alone." Rose took a deep breath. This was the moment. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I know it's crazy, but," she paused, gathering her courage, "would you consider joining me? Becoming partners in this? We could build something here, something real and meaningful." Jack stared at her, clearly shocked. "You want me to give up my job, my apartment, everything, to farm with you?" "Not just farm," Rose said, her words coming faster now. "We could make this a model of sustainability. Organic crops, renewable energy, all the things you talk about. We could do it here together." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Rose knew that whatever grew between them, whether it was a business partnership or something more complicated, it had taken root, just like the seeds in this rich soil, waiting to grow into something neither of them could yet imagine.
Jack stood up and walked a few steps away, running his hands through his hair. Rose could see the tension in his shoulders, the conflict playing across his face. For a long moment he said nothing, just looked out at the land. "Rose, he finally turned back to her, "this is a lot to take in. You're talking about completely changing our lives." Rose nodded, suddenly worried she had pushed too far too fast. "I know it sounds crazy." "It does," he agreed, but then a small smile appeared. "But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about doing something like this, just not with my aunt." The word hung between them, a reminder of their connection, the reason they shouldn't be feeling whatever was growing between them. "Stay the week," Rose said, softening her approach. "Help me make some plans. See if this feels right, no commitment beyond that." Jack considered this, then nodded slowly. "Okay, 1 week." They drove back to town to check out of the motel and buy supplies. At the local hardware store, they found themselves in a deep conversation with the owner about soil quality and growing seasons. As they loaded bags of basic tools and cleaning supplies into the car, a truck pulled up next to them. "You folks must be checking out the old Miller place," a deep voice called. Rose turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man around her age climbing out of the truck. He had weathered skin and kind eyes, and moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his body. Yes, actually I inherited it, Rose said, extending her hand. I'm Rose and this is Jack. Tom Baker, the man said, shaking her hand, then Jack's. My farm borders yours to the east. Saw your car up there earlier. Thought I'd introduce myself. Tom turned out to be a valuable source of information. He ran an organic farm, specializing in heirloom vegetables and free-range eggs. He offered to show them around his operation if they were interested. That would be wonderful, Rose said, genuinely excited. How about dinner tonight, at my place? Tom asked, his eyes lingering on Rose. I make a mean beef stew from my own cattle. Rose felt a flutter of interest at his attention. It had been a long time since a man had looked at her that way. We'd love to, wouldn't we, Jack? Jack's smile seemed forced. Sounds great. Back at the farmhouse, they spent the afternoon cleaning the kitchen and one of the bedrooms enough to make them usable. Without discussing it, they both knew they would be staying at the property tonight rather than returning to the motel. Rose found herself watching Jack as he worked, his sleeves rolled up, muscles flexing as he moved furniture and scrubbed surfaces. There was something deeply attractive about seeing him work with his hands, focused and capable. I'm going to wash up before we head to Tom's, Jack said when they had made enough progress for one day. He hesitated. But there's just the one bathroom. And no shower curtain yet. I'll wait outside, Rose said quickly. Take your time. She sat on the porch steps, watching the sun begin its descent behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The beauty of this place overwhelmed her. She could imagine morning coffees on this porch, watching seasons change, growing old here. For the first time since her divorce, Rose felt truly hopeful about her future. When Jack emerged, hair damp and wearing a clean shirt, they drove to Tom's farm, following his directions. His house was smaller than Rose's farmhouse but well-maintained, with a modern kitchen and comfortable furnishings. True to his word, the stew was delicious, accompanied by fresh bread and vegetables from his garden. Throughout dinner, Rose noticed Tom's attention to her, refilling her wine glass, asking about her life in the city, his knee occasionally touching hers under the table. It was flattering, and he was undeniably attractive in a rugged, straightforward way. Yet she kept finding her eyes drawn to Jack, who had grown increasingly quiet as the evening progressed. As Tom showed them around his property after dinner, pointing out his greenhouses and chicken coops, he placed his hand on the small of Rose's back, guiding her. She didn't move away from the touch, and when she glanced at Jack, she saw him watching the gesture, his jaw tight. The ride back to their farmhouse was silent, a tension between them that hadn't been there before. Rose wondered if she had imagined the connection with Jack, if she had projected her own confusing feelings onto him. Perhaps this attraction to Tom was simpler, more appropriate. He was her age, her neighbor, not her nephew. He represented the uncomplicated choice. Yet as they said goodnight at the top of the stairs, Jack's fingers brushed hers, lingering for just a moment. "Good night, Rose," he said softly. "Good night, Jack," she whispered back, and she knew that nothing about this situation was simple at all. The next morning, Rose woke to the smell of coffee. She found Jack in the kitchen, 2 mugs on the table and a notepad covered in his neat handwriting. "I've been up for hours," he said, sliding a mug toward her. "Couldn't sleep. Started making plans instead." Rose sat across from him, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Plans for what?" "The farm," he said simply. "If we were to do this. And I'm not saying I'm decided yet, but if we were, these are the first steps we'd need to take." Rose felt a surge of excitement as she looked at his notes. Jack had outlined a full renovation plan for the house, a planting schedule based on the local growing season, and rough sketches for solar panel placement. "Jack, this is incredible," she said, looking up at him with admiration. "It's just a start," he said, but she could see he was pleased by her reaction. "I was thinking we should spend today exploring the full property, get a better sense of what we're working with." They spent the morning walking the land, Jack taking soil samples and making notes about drainage and sun exposure. Rose found herself drawn to a small clearing near the lake, surrounded by old oak trees. "This spot," she said, standing in the middle of it. "There's something special here." Jack came to stand beside her, close enough that their arms almost touched. It would be perfect for events. Farm-to-table dinners, maybe small weddings. "You're thinking like a businessman already," Rose teased, nudging him with her elbow. "Just considering all options," he said, but his smile was warm. This place has potential in a lot of ways. They continued exploring, ending up at the lake's edge by midday. The water was clear and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Without discussing it, they both sat on a fallen log, shoulders touching now, looking out at the water. Tom called this morning, Jack said suddenly. While you were still asleep. He wants to take you to dinner in town tonight. Just you. Rose glanced at him, trying to read his expression. What did you tell him? I said I'd let you know when you woke up. His voice was carefully neutral, but Rose could feel tension in his body where it touched hers. And what do you think I should say? She asked softly. Jack was quiet for a long moment. I think, he finally said, that Tom is a good man. He knows this land, this life. He could be good for you. That's not what I asked, Rose said, turning to face him fully now. Jack met her eyes, and the raw emotion she saw there made her breath catch. I think you should do whatever makes you happy, Rose. Something shifted between them in that moment. Rose reached out slowly and placed her hand over his. And if being here doing this with you is what makes me happy. Jack's eyes dropped to their hands, then back to her face. Is it? Instead of answering, Rose leaned forward and brushed her lips against his, so lightly it was barely a kiss. She felt him freeze for an instant, then his hand came up to cup her cheek, and he kissed her back, gentle at first, then with growing urgency. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Jack rested his forehead against hers. We shouldn't, he whispered, but his hand still cradled her face. Why not? Rose asked. We're both adults. We're not really related. We barely knew each other before this trip. Your family, my parents, they wouldn't understand, Jack said, but she could hear the resistance weakening in his voice. We don't have to tell them yet, Rose said. We can figure this out first. See if it's real. Jack pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. Is that what you want? To see if this is real? Rose nodded. I haven't felt this alive in years. Maybe ever. When I'm with you, planning this future, I feel like anything is possible. Jack's smile was slow and beautiful. I feel it too. This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, just the certainty of two people who had found something unexpected and precious. Around them, the farm seemed to pulse with possibilities, the land they would cultivate together, the life they might build. Later, as the sun began to set, Rose called Tom. She thanked him for his dinner invitation but declined politely. When she hung up, Jack was watching her from across the room, his eyes filled with a question. I told him I already had plans for the evening, Rose said, walking toward him, plans that couldn't wait. Jack reached for her hand, pulling her gently closer. What kind of plans? Rose smiled, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in decades. The kind that start right now and might last a lifetime. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity and discovery. During daylight hours, Rose and Jack worked side by side, cleaning the house, making lists of repairs, and plotting out where to plant their first crops. Their evenings were spent researching organic farming techniques on Jack's laptop, their heads bent close together at the kitchen table, and at night they explored this new intimacy between them, learning each other's bodies with wonder and growing passion. On the 4th day, as they were working in what would become their vegetable garden, they heard the sound of a truck coming up the driveway. Jack straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and Rose felt a flutter of anxiety when she recognized Tom's vehicle. Thought you two might like some help, Tom called as he climbed out, carrying a box of seedlings. Brought you some tomato starts, best variety for this soil. Rose smiled, genuinely grateful. That's so kind, Tom. Thank you. Tom set the box down and looked around approvingly at their work. You've made good progress, but there's a storm coming tomorrow. You'll want to get those roof patches done before it hits. Jack nodded, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. I was planning to tackle it this afternoon. 2 sets of hands would make it faster, Tom offered. I've fixed more roofs than I can count. Rose watched as Jack considered this, then nodded. I'd appreciate the help. The 2 men worked on the roof while Rose continued preparing the garden beds. From time to time, she looked up to see them working together, passing tools, steadying ladders. By late afternoon, the roof was repaired, and Tom accepted their invitation to stay for dinner. Over a simple meal of pasta and salad, Tom shared stories about the area, the best places to sell produce, and the challenges of the local climate. There was a moment, as he was describing a particularly difficult harvest, when he reached across the table and placed his hand over Rose's. "You're going to need help," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This isn't a two-person job, especially for beginners." Rose felt Jack tense beside her but was surprised when he didn't disagree. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, carefully sliding her hand away from Tom's. Tom leaned back, looking between them. "I've been thinking about expanding my operation. Your land would be perfect. We could form a partnership. I've got the equipment, the knowledge. You've got the land," and clearly he gestured around at their progress, the work ethic. The offer hung in the air between them. Rose glanced at Jack, trying to read his thoughts. "It's worth considering," Jack said finally, surprising her. "We've been talking about how much we'd need to invest in equipment alone." Tom nodded, encouraged. "Exactly. And my connections with markets and restaurants would get you selling right away, instead of struggling through the first few seasons." After Tom left, with a promise to return the next day to discuss details, Rose and Jack sat on the porch in silence, watching night fall over their land. "Are you really considering his offer?" Rose asked finally. Jack was quiet for a long moment. "From a practical standpoint, it makes sense," he said, his voice careful. "But I think there's something else behind it." Rose turned to him. "What do you mean?" "He's interested in you, Rose. That's obvious." Jack's voice was calm, but she could hear the strain underneath. "And he's a good man with a lot to offer. The right age, the right experience." Rose felt a chill despite the warm evening. "Are you saying we should accept his help, because he might be a better match for me than you are?" Jack looked down at his hands. "I'm saying we need to be realistic about what we're doing here. About what we're starting." Rose stood up abruptly. "I thought we already decided that. I thought we were building this together." "We are," Jack said, reaching for her hand. "But Tom showing up today reminded me that there's a world beyond this farm. People who will have opinions about us. Practical concerns we can't ignore." Rose pulled her hand away. "So you'd rather I be with Tom, is that it?" The pain in Jack's eyes was visible even in the dim light. "No, God no. I want you with me. But I need to know that you've really thought this through, that this isn't just some farm fantasy that will fall apart when reality hits." Rose felt tears threatening. All the certainty of the past few days suddenly seemed fragile. "And you think Tom is reality? That what we're feeling isn't?" Jack stood up and took her hands again, this time not letting her pull away. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to be sure, for both our sakes." Rose looked up at him, at this man who had somehow become the center of her world in less than a week. "And how do we do that?" Morning brought the promised storm, rain drumming on the newly repaired roof. Rose woke alone in bed, the space beside her cold. For a moment, fear gripped her heart. Had Jack left? Had their conversation last night driven him away? She pulled on her robe and hurried downstairs, relief flooding through her when she found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, his laptop open. His hair was rumpled, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. "You've been up all night," she said softly. Jack looked up, his eyes tired but clear. "I needed to be sure." He gestured for her to sit, then pushed a stack of papers toward her. Rose looked down at detailed business plans, financial projections, and farming schedules, all meticulously prepared. "These are two different plans," Jack explained. "This one is for a partnership with Tom. The other is just us. I've worked out the numbers every way I can." Rose scanned the documents, impressed by the thoroughness. And both could work," Jack said, running a hand through his already messy hair. "Tom's plan gets us to profitability faster. Ours takes longer, requires more investment up front, more risk." Rose looked at him, trying to read the thoughts behind his tired eyes. "But," a small smile touched Jack's lips, "but it's ours, all ours." Outside, the rain intensified, thunder rumbling in the distance. Jack stood and walked to the window, looking out at their land shrouded in mist and rain. "I've spent my whole life doing what made sense," he said without turning. "The practical choice, the safe choice, and I ended up in a job I hate, living a life that feels borrowed from someone else." He turned to face her. "I don't want that anymore, Rose. I want this land, this life. I want to build something that matters. He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. I want you. Rose stood slowly, her heart pounding. Are you sure? What about what you said last night? About the world beyond this farm? Jack crossed the room to her, taking her hands in his. The world will have opinions. My parents, your friends, they might not understand at first. Or ever. But I don't care. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want. Rose felt tears welling in her eyes. And what about Tom's offer? The practical choice. We'll thank him but decline, Jack said firmly. We can do this on our own. It might be harder, but it will be ours. He squeezed her hands. If that's still what you want. Rose didn't hesitate. It is. It's all I want. The rain continued all morning as they finalized their plans. By afternoon, the storm had broken, and when Tom's truck came up the drive, sunlight was beginning to peek through the clouds. Rose and Jack met him on the porch, standing side by side, their decision already made. Thought you might need help checking for leaks after that storm, Tom said, climbing the porch steps. Roof hold up okay? Perfect, Jack said. Thanks to your help. Tom nodded, looking between them. Have you thought more about my offer? Rose stepped forward. We have, Tom, and we're grateful, truly. But we've decided to develop the farm ourselves. Just the two of us. Tom was quiet for a moment, his eyes lingering on Rose, then moving to Jack. Something in their stance, the way they stood together, told him everything he needed to know. I see, he said finally. Well, the offer of neighborly help still stands. Farming's tough enough without going it completely alone. We appreciate that, Jack said, extending his hand. To Rose's relief, Tom shook it without hesitation. Good luck to you both, he said, his smile a little sad but genuine. This land's been waiting for someone to love it properly. I think it found the right people. After Tom left, Rose and Jack walked hand in hand down to the lake. The storm had cleared the air, making everything seem sharper, more vivid. The future stretched before them, not easy, not certain, but theirs to shape together. So, Jack said, turning to face her by the water's edge, are you ready to really shock me with what you want me to do with you on this land? Rose laughed, pulling him closer. Well, I was thinking we could start with a greenhouse right there, she said, pointing to a sunny spot near the orchard, and maybe some beehives beyond the garden. And then, Jack silenced her with a kiss. That all sounds perfect, he murmured against her lips, but I was thinking of something more immediate. As the sun broke fully through the clouds, warming their skin, Rose smiled up at the man who had become her partner in every sense. Show me, she whispered. Their laughter echoed across the water as they ran back to the farmhouse, to the beginning of their new life together. A life neither had expected, but both had chosen, with eyes and hearts wide open.